The glass door chimed as Victor Carbone pushed it open, and the scent of vanilla hit him like a physical blow, freezing his polished Italian leather shoes on the cracked Brooklyn linoleum. The boy whimpered, finally sensing the danger radiating from the stranger, and pressed his face into the fabric of Amelia's apron. "Ethan," she whispered, defeat cracking her voice. "His name is Ethan. Now get out." She pointed a shaking finger at the door. "Get out or I swear I will scream until the police come." Victor looked at the peeling paint on the walls, the cold oven, the poverty that clung to them like a second skin, and then back at the woman who threatened him with the law. "The police?" he asked softly, shaking his head. "You truly have forgotten who I am." He unlocked the door, the bell chiming cheerfully in stark contrast to the devastation in the room. "I'm leaving, Amelia," he said, pushing the door open and letting the cold Brooklyn air rush in. "But don't think for a second that this is over. I'll be back." Victor sat in the back of his armored Cadillac, the engine idling with a low, predatory purr that vibrated through the leather seats, while the rain began to slick the darkened streets of Brooklyn. For 3 hours, he had watched the bakery through the tinted bulletproof glass, his unlit cigar clamped between his teeth, counting the customers that never came. He noticed things he had been too blind to see in his initial shock, like the silver duct tape holding the corner of the display window together, and the way Amelia turned off the main lights every time the shop was empty to save on electricity. It was a poverty that gnawed at his gut, a stark, violent contrast to the penthouse suite and silk sheets he woke up in every morning. He watched her wipe down the counter with a rag that had seen better days, her movements slow and heavy with a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. She wasn't just working, she was surviving, barely keeping her head above water while raising the air to the Carbone empire in a building that looked like it would collapse if the wind blew too hard. When the last light in the bakery flickered out, Victor didn't wait for his driver to open the door. He stepped out into the drizzle, his presence commanding the shadows to retreat, and walked to the side entrance where he knew she lived. The door was thin, the lock laughable for a man who knew how to dismantle entire security systems, but he knocked this time, a heavy, rhythmic thud that sounded more like a summons than a request. Amelia opened it a crack, the chains still latched, her face pale and drawn in the harsh light of the street lamp. "I told you to leave," she whispered, though the venom was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. Victor didn't ask for permission. He simply looked at the chain until she unlocked it, her hands trembling as she stepped aside to let the wolf into her den. The apartment above the bakery was freezing, the air biting into his skin through his cashmere coat, and he realized with a jolt of horror that the heating was off. "You're freezing him," Victor said, his voice low and dangerous as he surveyed the cramped living room with its peeling wallpaper and threadbare rug. "You took my son from a life of royalty to live in a meat locker. Is this your idea of freedom, Amelia?" She turned on him then, her eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate fire. "Freedom is not wondering if your husband is coming home alive or in a body bag, Victor. Freedom is not having guards watching you sleep." She moved to the small kitchenette to fill a kettle, her back stiff and defensive, but before Victor could retort, a sound tore through the thin walls that froze the blood in his veins. It was a cough, wet and rattling, sounding less like a child and more like an old man with fluid in his lungs. It came from the bedroom where Ethan slept, a hacking, painful noise that went on for 10 agonizing seconds. Victor moved toward the bedroom door, but Amelia threw herself in his path, her hands slamming against his chest to stop him. "Don't go in there," she hissed, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "He just fell asleep. If you wake him, he won't breathe right for an hour." Victor grabbed her wrists, not to hurt her, but to hold her still, his gray eyes searching hers with a terrifying intensity. "That is not a cold, Amelia. That cough sounds like Duff. Tell me what is wrong with my son." She tried to pull away, but his grip was iron, and finally, The fight drained out of her, leaving her small and broken in his grasp. Ventricular septal defect, she choked out, the medical term sounding foreign and cruel in the small room. His heart, Victor. He has a hole in his heart. The words hit him harder than a bullet, staggering him back a step as he released her. A hole, he repeated, his voice hollow. Amelia wrapped her arms around herself, shivering from the cold and the confession. He needs surgery. A specialist in Manhattan. If he doesn't get it before winter sets in fully, the doctors say his heart won't handle the strain of another flu season. Victor looked at the closed bedroom door, visualizing the small boy with the dinosaur shirt fighting for every breath while he had been buying racehorses and island villas. How much? He asked, the question sharp and immediate. $250,000, Amelia whispered, looking at the floor. I applied for loans. I sold everything I had. I tried, Victor. I swear to God I tried. Victor reached into his jacket pocket for his checkbook, the solution simple and immediate in his mind. I will write the check tonight. I will have the best surgeons flown in from Zurich by morning. He is a Carbone. He does not die from something money can fix. He expected relief, expected her to fall to her knees in gratitude, but instead, Amelia slapped his hand away, the checkbook clattering to the floor. I don't want your money, she screamed, the sound raw and tearing. I won't take a single dime of blood money from you. Do you think I forgot? Do you think I can just take cash from the same family that tried to kill us? Victor froze, the anger vanishing, replaced by a cold confusion. Tried to kill you, he asked slowly. Amelia, what are you talking about? She looked at him with wild, terrified eyes. Your mother didn't just pay me to leave, Victor. She put a gun to my stomach. The words hung in the freezing air between them, heavy and suffocating like smoke from a burning bridge. Victor stood paralyzed, his mind reeling as it tried to reconcile the mother he knew, a woman of steel and tradition, yes, but a woman who claimed to love him above all else, with the monster Amelia was describing. For 5 years, he had nursed a bitter hatred for this woman, believing she had abandoned him for a payout, believing she was a coward who couldn't handle his world, yet now she stood before him, shivering in a threadbare sweater, claiming she had stared down the barrel of a gun to save his unborn son. My mother, Victor repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. You are telling me that Catherine Carbone, the matriarch of my family, came to our home and threatened your life? Do not lie to me, Amelia. If you are lying to absolve yourself of leaving me, I will know. Amelia laughed, a broken, jagged sound that was more terrifying than any scream. She walked to the window, staring out at the rain-slicked street as if watching a horror movie play out on the glass. It was 3 days after you told me you had to go to Chicago for the summit, she whispered, her voice devoid of emotion, as if she had recounted this nightmare 1,000 times in the dark. I was packing a bag to surprise you when I heard the door splinter. For men, Victor. She brought 4 armed men into our sanctuary. They threw me to the floor. I was pregnant, only 8 weeks along, but I knew. I tried to cover my stomach, but one of them put his boot on my back to keep me down. She turned to face him then, and Victor saw the ghost of that night in her eyes, the sheer terror that had never truly left her. Then your mother walked in. She was wearing that pearl necklace you gave her for her 60th birthday. She looked down at me like I was something she had stepped in on the sidewalk. Victor felt the blood drain from his face, his hands clenching into fists at his sides until the leather of his gloves creaked. He wanted to stop her, wanted to cover his ears to shut out the image of his mother, the woman who had wiped his tears when his father died, standing over his pregnant wife with a hit squad. But Amelia wasn't finished. She told the man to lift me up, Amelia continued, her voice trembling now. She pulled a gun from her purse, a small silver pistol. She pressed it right here. Amelia pressed her hand against her lower stomach, her fingers digging into the wool of her sweater. She said, "Victor knows. Victor wants this done. He made a mistake with a street rat, and he wants the mistake erased. She told me that if I didn't take the money and banish, she would pull the trigger, and there would be no child, no Amelia, just a tragic break-in gone wrong." The silence that followed was deafening. Victor felt as though the floor had opened up beneath him, dropping him into a free fall of vertigo and nausea. "She told you I knew," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "She told you I ordered it?" Amelia nodded, tears finally spilling over. "Why else would I leave, Victor? I loved you. I would have walked through fire for you. But I couldn't let you kill her, baby. So I took the bus ticket. I took the cash, which ran out in 2 months because of medical bills, and I ran. I ran to keep Ethan safe from his own father." A roar built in Victor's chest, a primal sound of rage and agony that he couldn't contain. He spun around and drove his fist into the plaster wall of the apartment. The impact was sickening, a wet crunch of drywall and wood splintering under the force of his fury. A shelf rattled, and a cheap ceramic vase crashed to the floor, shattering into a dozen pieces, but Victor didn't feel the pain in his knuckles. He only felt the betrayal that was tearing him apart from the inside out. He remembered that week 5 years ago. He remembered coming home to the empty apartment, the ring on the pillow. He remembered collapsing in his mother's arms, weeping like a child, while she stroked his hair and told him, "Shoo, my son. She wasn't worthy of you. She took the money I offered and left. She never loved you. It was all a lie. Every kind word, every comfort, every moment of support she had given him over the last 5 years was built on the foundation of an attempted murder of his own flesh and blood. She had looked him in the eye and lied while knowing his son was out there, possibly starving, possibly dying. She had watched him mourn a living woman. "I didn't know," Victor said, his voice breaking, sounding foreign to his own ears. He turned back to Amelia, his gray eyes wild and pleading, stripping away the mask of the Mafia Don to reveal the horrified man beneath. "Amelia, look at me. I didn't know. I tore this city apart looking for you. I hired investigators. I spent millions. They all told me you had vanished. I thought you left me. I swear on my life, on Ethan's life, I didn't know." Amelia looked at the hole in the wall, then back at him, seeing the raw, bleeding knuckles and the devastation on his face. She wanted to hate him. She had spent 5 years hating him, building a fortress of resentment to survive the lonely nights. But the pain in his eyes was too real to be feigned. "It doesn't matter if you knew or not," she whispered, exhaustion pulling at her shoulders. "She is your mother. She controls your world. If you come back into our lives, she will finish what she started. Ethan is sick, Victor. He is weak. He cannot survive a war with Victor Carbone." Victor walked to the door, stepping over the shattered remains of the vase. He paused with his hand on the latch, not looking back, because if he looked at her again, he might crumble completely. The cold, ruthless armor of the Don slid back into place, but this time, the target wasn't a rival gang or a business enemy. "There will be no war, Amelia," he said, his voice dropping to a register that promised violence of the most catastrophic kind. "Wars are fought between equals. Victor Carbone is no longer my equal. She is my target." He opened the door and walked out into the rain, leaving the warmth of the apartment for the cold darkness of the street, his mind already calculating the destruction he was about to rain down upon the woman who had birthed him. He would burn his own house to the ground if it meant digging out the rock that had infested it. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victor's penthouse office, mirroring the storm that had been raging inside him since he left Amelia's apartment. Marco stood before the mahogany desk, his usual stoicism replaced by a nervous shift in his stance, clutching a manila folder as if it contained a bomb. "You are right, boss," Marco said, his voice rough with the weight of the betrayal he was about to reveal. He slid the folder across the polished wood, and Victor opened it to reveal a series of bank transfers dated 5 years ago. The numbers were staggering, but it was the recipient that turned Victor's blood to ice. The private investigation firm, the one Victor had paid millions to find his missing wife, had received 3 separate payments from a shell company registered to Catherine Carbone. The dates aligned perfectly with the reports telling Victor that Amelia had vanished off the face of the earth. His mother hadn't just threatened Amelia, she had actively paid men to lie to her grieving son, ensuring that he remained in the dark while his child grew up in poverty. Victor closed the file, his hand trembling not with sadness, but with a cold, lethal fury that settled deep in his bones. He didn't smash anything this time. The time for tantrums was over, the time for war was approaching, but first, he had to secure the only thing that mattered. 2 hours later, Victor stood outside the bakery again, but the armored convoy was gone, replaced by a single black sedan parked discreetly down the block. He wasn't wearing his usual threatening overcoat. Instead, he held a massive box wrapped in bright primary colors, looking utterly ridiculous and terrifyingly out of place. When Amelia opened the door, her guard was instantly up, her body blocking the view of the back room, but her eyes softened slightly when she saw the Lego set, a complex, 1,000-piece starship that cost more than her monthly rent. "I didn't come to fight," Victor said, his voice low and humble, a tone he hadn't used in years. "I came to see him. Just for a moment. Please." Amelia hesitated, looking from the box to the man who looked like he was approaching a firing squad rather than a play date, and finally stepped aside. 10 minutes, she warned. "And if he gets scared, you leave." Ethan was sitting on the worn rug in the back room, playing with a plastic dinosaur that was missing a leg. He looked up when Victor entered, his gray eyes wide, and scrambled backward until his back hit the sofa. Victor froze, the pain of his son's fear cutting deeper than any knife, but he slowly lowered himself to the floor, disregarding the creases in his $3,000 suit. He placed the box between them and popped the lid, the sound of rattling plastic bricks breaking the silence. "I heard you like building things," Victor said, his voice rough but gentle. Ethan crept forward, drawn by the colorful mountain of bricks, his curiosity warring with his shyness. He picked up a red brick, then looked at Victor with a tilt of his head. "You're really big," the boy whispered, his eyes traveling up Victor's broad shoulders. "You're like a giant." Victor managed a small, crooked smile. "Then I guess I can help you build a really tall tower." For the next 20 minutes, the most feared man in New York sat cross-legged on a stained rug, his large, scarred hands fumbling with tiny plastic blocks as a 4-year-old dictated architectural orders. They built a tower that leaned dangerously to the left, a structure that defied physics and logic, but when it finally collapsed with a loud crash, Ethan didn't cry. He threw his head back and laughed, a pure, unbridled sound that seemed to chase the shadows out of the room. Victor watched him, feeling a strange warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since before Amelia left. He handed Ethan another brick, their fingers brushing, one rough and calloused from violence, the other small and fragile, and in that contact, Victor made a silent vow. He would burn the world down to keep this laugh alive. Amelia watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but the tightness around her eyes had loosened just a fraction. Victor left exactly when his time was up, keeping his word to Amelia to prove he was different from the man his mother had painted him to be. But as he sat in his car, watching the bakery lights glow in the dusk, he made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to his personal attorney. "The building on 4th and Main," Victor ordered, staring at the crumbling brick facade of Amelia's home. "Buy it. Tonight. Cash offer, double the market value. I want the deed in a shell company by morning. And fix the heating system immediately." The landlord who had let his son freeze would be gone by sunrise. The second call was to the chief of surgery at Mount Sinai Hospital. "You have a patient named Ethan Weston on your waiting list," Victor said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "His surgery is fully funded. An anonymous donation from the Guardian Trust. And doctor, if he dies, the hospital closes." He hung up, watching the steam rise from the bakery vents as the heat kicked on for the first time in years. He couldn't undo the past 5 years, but he could buy the future, one shadow move at a time. The iron gates of the Carbone estate on Long Island swung open with a reluctant groan, yielding to the grim authority of Victor's convoy as it tore up the gravel driveway. The mansion stood like a mausoleum of old money and buried secrets, its white marble columns gleaming under the morning sun, hiding the rot that festered within its walls. Victor didn't wait for the chauffeur to open his door. Stepping onto the manicured lawn with a stride that promised violence, his shadow stretching long and dark across the pristine grass. The household staff, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure that accompanied the dawn's rage, scattered like cockroaches when a light is flipped on, leaving the path to the sunroom clear. Catherine Carbone sat there, framed by blooming orchids and expensive silk drapes, sipping Earl Grey from a porcelain cup that cost more than Amelia's entire bakery. She looked up as the glass doors slid open, her face a mask of practiced serenity, though a flicker of unease darted through her eyes when she saw the look on her son's face. It wasn't the heat of anger she saw there, but the absolute zero of a glacier that had finally broken free. Victor stopped at the edge of the table, the crystal and silver rattling slightly under the weight of his presence. He didn't scream, didn't overturn the table, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it onto the saucer of her teacup with a dull thud that cracked the delicate china. Photographs spilled out across the lace tablecloth, images of a 4-year-old boy with gray eyes playing in a sordid back room, copies of overdue medical bills, and the bank records Marco had unearthed just hours before. Catherine looked down at the mess, her expression tightening as she recognized the face of the child she had sentenced to poverty. "I see you found them," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of guilt, as if discussing a misplaced earring rather than her own flesh and blood. "I suppose congratulations are in order, though I had hoped you would have moved on to a more suitable match by now." "You paid men to lie to me," Victor said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that made the air feel thin. "You held a gun to the stomach of a pregnant woman and threatened to kill my heir. You let your grandson freeze in a tenement with a hole in his heart while you sat here drinking tea." Catherine set her cup down, the facade cracking just enough to reveal the steel beneath. "I did what was necessary to protect this family from a parasite, Victor. That girl was a waitress with a drug addict mother and no name. She would have dragged you down into the gutter she crawled out of." She picked up a photo of Ethan, holding it by the corner as if it were contaminated. "And this child? A mixed-breed mistake. A mongrel born of a weak mother. Do you think the other families would respect a Don whose heir looks like he belongs in a soup kitchen? I purified your bloodline, Victor. You should be thanking me." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that precedes a natural disaster. Victor looked at the woman who had given him life and realized with a sickening clarity that she was the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced. He leaned down, placing his hands flat on the table, bringing his face inches from hers. "You speak of family," he whispered, "but you have forgotten the first rule of the Carbone Code. Blood is sacred." He straightened up, adjusting his cuffs with terrifying precision. "As of this moment, your access to the family accounts is revoked. Your security detail is dismissed. The stuff will be reassigned to my penthouse. You are no longer the matriarch of this family, Catherine. You are a ghost haunting a house you no longer own." Catherine stood up then, her face flushing with a sudden, ugly rage, the mask shattering completely. "You can't do this," she hissed, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. "I built you. I made you who you are. You are nothing without me." Victor turned his back on her, walking toward the door without breaking stride. "You are right, Mother. You made me a monster, and now that monster is done taking orders from you." He left her standing alone in the sunroom, surrounded by the wreckage of her arrogance, screaming his name at a back that would never turn to her again. But as Victor walked away, leaving his mother isolated in her gilded cage, he didn't see the look that settled in her eyes. It wasn't regret. It was the cold, calculating look of a woman who realized that if she couldn't control the king, she would have to burn down the kingdom to destroy him. Amelia stood in the center of the bakery kitchen, her flour-dusted hands trembling as she pressed the phone to her ear, listening to the voice of the hospital administrator on the other end. The words didn't make sense at first, floating through her mind like a foreign language: paid in full, guardian trust, surgery scheduled for Tuesday. But as the reality settled in, her knees gave way and she sank onto the cold tile floor. She didn't need to ask who was behind the anonymous donation, because there was only one man in the world who had the power to make $250,000 of debt vanish with a single phone call. When Victor walked through the back door 10 minutes later, checking on the security upgrades he had ordered, he found her sitting there, tears streaming down a face that finally looked like it was breathing for the first time in years. "You did this," she whispered, not an accusation but a revelation, looking up at him as if seeing him clearly through the fog of their past. Victor didn't deny it, didn't posture or brag. He simply leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. "He is my son, Amelia," he said quietly, his gray eyes soft. "I told you. He does not suffer for things I can fix. I didn't want you to refuse the money out of pride, so I made sure you couldn't." The walls Amelia had built to keep him out, the fortress of resentment and fear she had constructed brick by brick over 5 years, began to crumble into dust. She stood up and walked toward him, stopping only inches away, her hand reaching out to tentatively touch the lapel of his coat. "Thank you," she breathed, the words carrying the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "You saved his life, Victor." He caught her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with a familiar electricity, a magnetic pull that time and tragedy hadn't been able to sever. "I am moving you out of here," Victor said, his voice rough with a sudden intensity. "The surgery is in 3 days. The recovery will be brutal. You cannot nurse him in a drafty apartment above a bakery in a neighborhood I don't control. You are coming to the penthouse. Just until he is safe. Just until he is strong enough." Amelia wanted to argue, wanted to cling to her independence, but she thought of Ethan's wet cough and the drafty windows, and she nodded. She was done fighting him. She was ready to let him be the father he promised to be. The transition to Victor's penthouse in Manhattan was like stepping onto another planet, a world of glass, steel, and silence that hovered 50 stories above the chaos of the city. Ethan ran through the sprawling living room, his eyes wide with wonder, sliding on the marble floors in his socks and shouting that they lived in the sky now. Victor watched them from the kitchen island, a glass of whiskey in his hand, feeling a strange tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with stress. For years, this apartment had been a cold, empty museum of his success, a place where he slept and showered between wars, but with Amelia's coat thrown over a chair and Ethan's laughter echoing off the high ceilings, it finally felt like a home. He saw Amelia standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the glittering skyline, her silhouette framed by the city lights. She looked small against the vastness of New York, yet she was the only thing that anchored him to the earth. He walked over to her, the ice in his glass clinking softly, and stood beside her, close enough to smell the vanilla and soap scent that still clung to her skin. "It's beautiful," Amelia whispered, not looking away from the view. "And terrifying. Being up this high, It feels like we could fall at any moment. Victor turned to face her, placing his glass on a side table, and reached out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I won't let you fall," he promised, his voice low and intimate in the quiet room. "I spent 5 years falling, Amelia. I am done with gravity." She turned to him, her green eyes searching his, looking for the boy she had loved in the man who had become a king. The distance between them vanished, the years of pain and lies dissolving in the heat of the moment. Victor leaned in, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Amelia's breath hitched, her eyelids fluttering shut as she leaned into his touch, her body remembering the safety of his arms. Their lips were a fraction of an inch apart, the air charged with the promise of a second chance, when the sharp, jarring buzz of Victor's phone shattered the moment. He froze, his forehead resting against hers for a heartbeat, a growl of frustration vibrating in his throat. He pulled back, his eyes dark with regret, and pulled the phone from his pocket. It was a secure line, a red notification pulsing on the screen that meant emergency. "I have to take this," he said, his voice clipping back into the cold, professional tone of the dawn. Amelia nodded, stepping back and wrapping her arms around herself as the cold air rushed into the space between them. "Go," she said softly. "We're safe here." Victor walked out onto the balcony to answer the call, leaving Amelia alone in the living room. As he listened to the voice on the other end, he looked back at her through the glass, a heavy sense of foreboding settling in his gut. He had promised she was safe, but in his world, safety was just an illusion waiting to be shattered. The silence in the Carbone mansion was absolute, a suffocating blanket that pressed against Catherine's eardrums until she wanted to scream. Stripped of her security detail, ignored by the few remaining staff who now reported directly to Marco, and locked out of the family accounts, the once feared matriarch had been reduced to a prisoner in her own home. She sat in her husband's old study, the heavy velvet drapes drawn against the moonlight, a glass of amber scotch trembling in her hand as she stared at the burner phone sitting on the mahogany desk. It was a cheap, disposable device she had kept hidden in a hollowed-out book for emergencies, never imagining that the emergency would be her own son's betrayal. Victor had chosen a nameless waitress and a sickly child over the empire she had built for him, choosing sentiment over strength, and in Catherine's twisted logic, that made him unfit to rule until he was broken and rebuilt. She didn't see herself as a traitor. She saw herself as a surgeon cutting out a tumor to save the patient, even if the patient had to bleed to survive. With a hand that had steadied itself with liquid courage, Catherine picked up the phone and dialed a number that no Carbone should ever possess. It rang 3 times before a rough, gravelly voice answered, sounding amused and suspicious in equal measure. "This is a private line," Tony Moreno said, the background noise of a thumping bass line suggesting he was holding court in one of his Jersey clubs. "You better have a good reason for having it, or you're going to regret dialing." Catherine took a breath, steeling her voice into the imperious tone that had commanded hitmen and politicians alike for decades. "This is Catherine Carbone," she stated, cutting through his posturing. "And I am offering you the keys to the kingdom, Mr. Moreno. But only if you have the stomach to take them." The line went silent, the music fading as Moreno likely stepped into a quieter room, his interest piqued by the smell of blood in the water. "I'm listening," he replied, his voice dropping an octave. "But if this is a trap, I'll send back your head in a box." "Victor has a weakness," Catherine said, her eyes fixing on the portrait of her late husband hanging above the fireplace, her voice devoid of maternal warmth. "A woman and a child. He has moved them to the penthouse, thinking they are safe, but he is distracted. He is soft." She paused, knowing that the next words would seal her fate, but she pushed them out anyway. "I can give you the rotation of his guard detail. I can give you the route they will take to the hospital for the boys' checkup on Monday. I can give you the window when Victor will be pulled away to the docks." Moreno laughed, a low, wet sound that made Catherine's skin crawl. "You're selling out your own son? That's cold, Catherine. Even for us." Catherine gripped the phone tighter. "I am teaching him a lesson he refuses to learn. But I have conditions. The woman, do with her what you will. She is nothing. But the boy remains untouched. He is my grandson. He is Carbone blood. You use him as leverage, you scare Victor, and then you return the child to me. Do we have a deal?" "Deal," Moreno lied, the words sliding out of his mouth with the ease of a serpent. "I get the territory, you get the kid and your throne back. Send me the details." Catherine relayed the information, the security gaps, the vehicle descriptions, the timing of the distraction, feeling a sick sense of victory as she sealed the pact. She hung up, draining her scotch in one gulp, convincing herself that she had just saved the family legacy. She didn't know that on the other end of the line, in a smoke-filled backroom in Newark, Tony Moreno was already laughing at her stupidity. He tossed his phone onto the table and looked at his top enforcer, a man with a scar running down his cheek. "The old bat gave us everything," Moreno sneered, lighting a cigar. "She thinks we're going to play daycare with the kid." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. "When we grab them, kill the girl, kill the kid, and send the bodies to Victor in pieces. I want the Carbone line ended, root and stem." Monday morning broke with the violence of a sledgehammer shattering glass, the piece of the penthouse obliterated by a frantic call from the harbor master at 6 in the morning. Victor's primary shipping warehouse in Red Hook had detonated, a massive fireball consuming millions of dollars in inventory and threatening to spread to the adjacent fuel depots. The sky to the east was already stained a bruised purple by the smoke, and Victor, dressed in tactical gear within minutes, felt the pull of the crisis like a physical hook in his gut. He hesitated at the door, looking back at Amelia and Ethan, who were finishing breakfast, and gnawing unease tightening his chest. "I have to go," he told Amelia, kissing her hard, his hand lingering on the back of her neck, as if trying to memorize the pulse beneath her skin. "The fire is a disaster, but the security detail stays with you. 2 cars for men. Marco goes with me." Amelia adjusted his collar, her eyes filled with a worry she couldn't voice. "Be safe," she whispered. "We just have the checkup at Mount Sinai. We'll be back before lunch." Victor nodded, but as the elevator doors slid shut, severing his view of them, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking away from the only thing that mattered to fight a fire that felt too staged, too convenient, and too loud. The ambush was executed with military precision, a trap sprung the moment Victor's convoy vanished into the smoke-choked distance of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. Amelia's armored SUV wound through the narrow streets of the Upper East Side, the morning traffic sluggish and heavy, when a sanitation truck suddenly lurched across the intersection, blocking their path. The driver cursed, slamming on the brakes, but before the lead bodyguard could radio for backup, the rear window of the trailing security car exploded inward. Men in black tactical masks swarmed from the alleyways like cockroaches, their suppressed submachine guns coughing rhythmic, deadly bursts that turned the escort vehicle into a tomb within seconds. Amelia screamed, throwing her body over Ethan in the back seat as the driver of her car tried to throw the heavy vehicle into reverse, but a van slammed into their rear bumper, pinning them in a steel crush. The driver reached for his weapon, but a single shot through the windshield ended his loyalty, leaving Amelia and Ethan trapped in a cage of bulletproof glass and twisted metal, surrounded by monsters who moved with the confidence of men who knew no help was coming. Amelia didn't freeze. She didn't weep. She tapped into a reservoir of primal rage that had been dormant since the night she fled New York 5 years ago. "Get down, Ethan. Get on the floor and cover your head," she ordered, her voice cutting through the boy's terrified sobs. She scrambled over the center console, shoving the driver's body aside, her hands slick with his blood as she gripped the steering wheel. She slammed the car into drive and floored the accelerator, the heavy SUV groaning as it smashed into the sanitation truck, trying to forge a path through the blockade. Metal screeched against metal, sparks showering the windshield, but the blockade held firm. The passenger side window, already spider-webbed from impact, finally gave way under the repeated blows of a sledgehammer wielded by one of the attackers. A gloved hand reached in to unlock the door, but Amelia grabbed a pen from the dashboard and drove it into the man's wrist with all the force of a desperate mother. He howled, jerking back, but two more men took his place, ripping the door open and dragging her out by her hair. She fought them like a wild animal, kicking, biting, and scratching, her nails digging deep furrows into the exposed neck of the man holding her. "Run, Ethan! Run!" she screamed, her voice raw and tearing, but the boy was frozen in the back seat, staring at the violence with wide, traumatized eyes. The attacker she had wounded backhanded her across the face, the force of the blow snapping her head back and filling her mouth with the copper taste of blood. "Shut her up," another voice commanded, cold and impatient. Amelia felt the sharp prick of a needle in her neck, and the world began to tilt and gray out. Her limbs turned to lead, her screams dying in her throat as she slumped against the pavement. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her completely was a man reaching into the back seat to pull a crying Ethan from the car, the boy clutching his plastic dinosaur as if it could save him from the nightmare. Victor stood amidst the inferno of his warehouse, the heat singing his eyebrows, staring at the empty shell of the building. There were no bodies inside, no signs of a rival crew, just incendiary devices set on timers. It was a decoy. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, staggering him more than the explosion ever could. He ripped his phone from his vest, his fingers trembling as he dialed the head of Amelia's detail. Straight to voicemail. He dialed the second guard. Voicemail. He dialed Amelia. The call rang and rang, a lonely, hollow sound echoing against the roar of the fire. "Marco," Victor roared, turning to his underboss, his eyes wild with a panic that terrified his men. "Track the car." "No." Marco looked at his tablet, his face draining of color. "The signal is dead, boss. Last location was Park Avenue and 86th. They're off the grid." Victor dropped the phone, the screen shattering on the asphalt, and looked toward the city skyline hidden behind the smoke. They were gone. He had walked right into the fire and left the door to his heart wide open. The intersection of Park and 86th was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered glass, the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers painting the carnage in a strobe light nightmare. Victor walked through the police tape as if it didn't exist, his face a mask of terrifying calm that made even the seasoned detectives step out of his way without a word. The wreckage of the convoy was smoking in the rain, the armored SUVs crumpled like aluminum cans against the sanitation truck, the bodies of his guards already covered in yellow tarts. But Victor didn't look at the dead. His eyes scanned the wet pavement, searching for a sign of life, for a clue, for anything that would tell him his family was still breathing. He saw it near the gutter, half submerged in a puddle of oil and rainwater, a small, green plastic dinosaur with a missing leg. He knelt, ruining the knees of his suit pants, and picked it up, his large hand closing over the toy that Ethan had slept with every night since they moved into the penthouse. The plastic was cold, slick with grime, and as Victor stared at it, the phantom sound of his son's laughter echoed in his mind, instantly replaced by the boy's terrified screams. He didn't roar in anger. Instead, a cold, suffocating silence descended over him, a black hole of rage that swallowed every other emotion, leaving only a singular, murderous purpose. Back in the mobile command center that Marco had set up in the back of a surveillance van, Victor stared at the screen of his phone as a video message loaded from an encrypted server. The image was grainy, shot in low light, but the faces were unmistakable. Amelia was zip-tied to a chair, her face bruised and swollen, blood drying on her lip, but her eyes were burning with a fierce, protective defiance. Beside her, huddled on a filthy mattress in the corner, Ethan was curled into a ball, his small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Then Tony Moreno stepped into the frame, a smug grin plastered across his scarred face, holding a newspaper with today's date. "Tick-tock," Victor Moreno sneered, the audio distorting slightly. "You want them back? Sign over the deed to the Brooklyn docks and formally step down from the commission. You have 48 hours. If I see a single cop, or if you try to be a hero, I'll mail you the kid in pieces, starting with his fingers." The video cut to black, leaving Victor staring at his own reflection in the dark screen, his expression so devoid of humanity that Marco instinctively took a step back. "Trace it," Victor ordered, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "I don't care about the IP address. Moreno is too smart for that. I want to know who gave them the route." Marco typed furiously, his fingers flying across the keyboard, cross-referencing the encrypted communication logs from the penthouse security system. "The route was generated offline," Marco said, sweat beading on his forehead. "Only 3 people had access to the final itinerary: you, the lead driver, and the household manager who coordinated the schedule." Victor's eyes narrowed. The driver was dead in the street. That left the household manager, a woman named Elena who had served his mother for 20 years before being transferred to the penthouse. "Bring her to me," Victor said, turning away from the screens. "And bring my mother's personal assistant from the estate. I want to know exactly how the information moved from my house to Jersey." 10 minutes later, in the soundproof basement of one of his safe houses, Victor stood before Elena. She was weeping, trembling in a metal chair, swearing on her children's lives that she hadn't said a word. Victor believed her fear, but he didn't believe her innocence. He placed the green dinosaur toy on the table in front of her, the plastic clicking softly against the metal. "This belongs to my son," he said, his voice terrifyingly gentle. "He is 4 years old. He is currently in the hands of men who butcher people for sport because someone told them where he would be. If you do not tell me you spoke to Elena, I will make you feel every ounce of pain that he is feeling right now." She broke instantly, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. "It was Catherine," she choked out. "She called me on the house line. She said she was worried about the boy's health. She asked for the schedule so she could send a gift to the hospital. She swore she just wanted to be a grandmother. I didn't know, Victor. I didn't know." Victor walked out of the room, leaving Elena weeping into her hands, the confirmation settling in his gut like a stone. His mother hadn't just betrayed him. She had orchestrated the slaughter of his men and the abduction of his child under the guise of maternal concern. He walked into the main room where 50 of his most loyal soldiers were arming themselves, the air thick with the smell of gun oil and tension. They looked at him, waiting for the order, waiting to see if the Don would negotiate or surrender. Victor picked up an assault rifle from the table, checking the chamber with a metallic clack that silenced the room. "Tony Moreno has my family," he announced, his voice carrying to the back of the room without shouting. "He thinks he can use them to take my city. He thinks I will trade my empire for their lives." He looked at Marco, then at the rows of hardened men who had bled for him for a decade. "We do not negotiate with dead men. We are going to find them, and we are going to kill everyone who stands in our way. No police. No mercy. Tonight, we burn Jersey to the ground." The abandoned meatpacking plant in Queens sat on the edge of the industrial district like a rotting carcass, its rusted corrugated metal walls vibrating with the low hum of the portable generators Tony Moreno had set up inside. Victor crouched in the shadows of the perimeter fence, the rain slicking his tactical vest and plastering his hair to his forehead, while Marco and 20 of his best enforcers fanned out to surround the building in a silent, lethal ring. There would be no negotiation, no ransom drop, and no mercy, because the moment Moreno touched Ethan, He had signed his own death warrant in blood. "Wait for my signal," Victor whispered into his calms, his voice void of any human warmth. "When the shooting starts, breach from the rear and kill anything that moves." He didn't wait for an acknowledgement. He stood up and walked toward the main loading bay doors, holding a suppressed assault rifle in each hand, stepping into the floodlights with the terrifying confidence of a man who had already accepted his own death as the price of admission. Victor kicked the steel door open with a crash that echoed through the cavernous plant, instantly drawing the fire of the 3 guards stationed in the entryway. Bullets sparked against the door frame and tugged at his Kevlar vest, but Victor moved with the fluidity that belied his size, raising his weapons and unleashing a rhythmic, precise hail of lead that dropped the men before they could scream. He stepped over their bodies, his boots splashing in the mixture of rainwater and fresh blood, and moved deeper into the facility, the smell of old grease and copper filling his nose. The warehouse was a labyrinth of hanging chains and rusted conveyor belts, a nightmare of shadows where muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers. A gunman popped out from behind a crate, firing a wild burst that tore through the meat of Victor's left shoulder, the impact spinning him around and sending a shockwave of white-hot agony down his arm. He didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He gritted his teeth against the pain, turning the spin into a firing stance and putting 2 rounds into the attacker's chest, his adrenaline surging so high that the wound felt like nothing more than a bee sting. The gunfire from the rear of the building erupted then, a chaotic symphony of automatic weapons as Marco's team breached the perimeter, pulling Marino's men away from the center of the plant. Victor used the distraction to push into the main processing room, a vast, open space dominated by rusted meat hooks hanging from the ceiling. At the far end, illuminated by a single hanging bulb, Tony Moreno stood with his back to a heavy steel table, his arm wrapped tight around Amelia's neck, a serrated hunting knife pressed dangerously close to her jugular. Ethan was huddled in the corner behind his stack of pallets, his hands over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut against the horror. "Drop it, Victor," Moreno screamed, his voice cracking with the desperation of a rat realizing the trap had snapped shut. "Drop the guns or I open her throat right here." Victor froze, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his fingertips onto the concrete floor. He saw the terror in Amelia's eyes, but beneath it, he saw something else, the same fierce, unyielding resolve that had kept her alive for 5 years on the streets. Victor slowly lowered his weapons, letting them clatter to the floor, but he didn't raise his hands. He kept them at his sides, his muscles coiled like steel springs. "It's over, Tony," Victor said, his voice deadly calm over the distant sounds of the dying firefight. "You're the only one left. Let them go, and I'll make it quick." Moreno laughed, a manic, jagged sound, and pressed the knife harder until a thin line of red appeared on Amelia's white skin. "You don't get to win, Carbone." Moreno spat, shifting his weight. "I'm going to kill her, then I'm going to kill the brat, and then..." He never finished the sentence. Amelia, seeing Victor's gaze flick to her feet, drove the heel of her boot down onto Moreno's instep with every ounce of strength she possessed, the sharp heel crushing the small bones of his foot. Moreno howled, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second as he instinctively jerked back. That fraction was all Victor needed. In one fluid motion, he drew the backup pistol from his waistband and fired a single shot. The bullet struck Moreno squarely between the eyes, snapping his head back and sending him crashing into the pile of rusted machinery behind him. Amelia scrambled away, gasping for air, and Victor was there in an instant, dropping to his knees and pulling her into his chest, disregarding the blood soaking his shirt. "I've got you," he whispered into her hair, his hands shaking as the adrenaline crash finally hit him. "I've got you." Ethan ran from his hiding spot, colliding with them in a sobbing heap, and Victor wrapped his good arm around his son, burying his face in the boy's neck. They knelt there on the cold, dirty floor of the slaughterhouse, surrounded by death, but holding on to life with a grip that would never be broken again. The boardroom of the five families was a chamber of silence and smoke, a windowless vault beneath a legitimate Italian restaurant in Midtown where the fate of New York's underworld had been decided for half a century. Victor sat at the head of the heavy oak table, his left arm in a sling, the fresh bandages stark white against his black suit, while the other four Dons watched him with eyes like sharks sensing blood in the water. Catherine Carbone sat in a wooden chair in the center of the room, stripped of her jewelry, her phone, and her dignity, her hands folded in her lap in a desperate pantomime of composure. She looked small surrounded by the men she had once commanded through whispers and shadow influence, but she held her chin high, clinging to the delusion that her status as the Queen Mother would shield her from the consequences of her treason. She didn't understand that in this room, titles meant nothing, only blood and loyalty held currency, and she was bankrupt in both. Victor didn't speak. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a cracked smartphone, the screen spiderwebbed from the violence of the slaughterhouse. It was Tony Marino's phone, retrieved from his corpse, a digital witness to the sins of the past 48 hours. Victor placed it in the center of the table and pressed play, the audio amplified by the room's acoustics. Catherine's voice filled the air, clear and unmistakable, bargaining with the enemy, trading the security routes of her own son and the location of her grandson for a promise of power. The Dons listened in stone-faced silence as she authorized the kidnapping, as she explicitly offered up Amelia as a sacrificial lamb, and as she made a deal with a man who was a sworn enemy of the commission. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was heavier than lead. Catherine's face had drained of all color, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a defense that didn't exist. "I did it for the family," she finally whispered, the words sounding weak and pathetic. "I did it to save the Carbone legacy from ruin." "You sold my son to a butcher," Victor said, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying finality. "You conspired with an outsider to harm a child of the blood. There is no law in our world that protects you from this." Don Benedetti, the oldest of the sit-down, nodded slowly, his eyes hard. "The penalty for betraying blood is death, Victor. You know this. We will respect your right to carry it out." Catherine flinched, her eyes starting to the guards by the door, realizing for the first time that she might not leave this room alive. She looked at Victor, searching for the boy she had raised, for a shred of the love he had once held for her, but she found only the cold, impenetrable gaze of the Don she had created. "Victor," she pleaded, her voice cracking, "I am your mother. You cannot kill me. You cannot have my blood on your hands." Victor stood up, the chair scraping harsh against the floor, and walked around the table until he stood directly in front of her. "Death would be a mercy, Catherine," he said softly, looking down at her with a profound lack of pity. "And I have no mercy left for you. If I kill you, you become a martyr. A tragedy. I will not give you that honor." He signaled to Marco, who stepped forward holding a manila envelope containing a one-way plane ticket and a set of keys to a rusted farmhouse in the middle of Nebraska. "You are exiled," Victor pronounced, the sentence hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. "You will be taken to a property with no phone, no internet, and no staff. You will have no access to money. You will have no name. If you try to contact anyone in New York, if you try to leave the property, the order to kill you will be executed immediately." Catherine stared at the envelope, horror dawning on her face as she realized the true depth of her punishment. She was a woman who thrived on power, on influence, on being the center of the universe. To be stripped of her identity and forced to live in silence, forgotten and irrelevant, was a fate far worse than a bullet. "You can't do this," she shrieked, her composure shattering completely as she lunged for him, but Marco caught her arm, holding her back with ease. "I am Catherine Carbone. I am the Carbone family. You are nothing without me." Victor turned his back on her, walking toward the exit without breaking stride. "Take her away," he ordered, his voice flat. "The Carbone family is done with her." As the guards dragged her out of the room, Catherine's screams echoed off the stone walls, a raw, primal sound of a woman realizing she had dug her own grave. "Victor, Victor, please. Don't leave me. Don't do this." But the heavy oak doors slammed shut, cutting off her voice and sealing her fate. Victor stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the fading sounds of his mother being dragged into oblivion. He felt a phantom pain in his wounded shoulder, but the weight in his chest, the heavy stone that had been crushing him for 5 years, was finally gone. He had cut out the rot. He had burned the bridge. And as he walked out of the restaurant into the cool night air of New York City, he took the first breath of a life that finally belonged to him. Winter released its grip on New York City slowly, the slush and gray skies of a violent season giving way to the fragile, pale green promise of spring in Central Park. Victor sat on a park bench, his coat unbuttoned, watching a boy in a bright red jacket sprint across the grass with lungs that no longer wheezed or rattled. 6 months ago, Ethan couldn't walk up a flight of stairs without turning blue, but today, thanks to the jagged pink scar hidden beneath his shirt, a zipper of survival that Victor regarded as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The boy was faster than the wind. Marco stood a respectful distance away, not as a bodyguard, but as the new head of the family operations. They had signed the papers that morning. Victor retained the legitimate real estate portfolio, the clean money, and the buildings that reached for the sky, while Marco took the streets, the shadows, and the weight of the crown that had nearly crushed Victor's soul. It was a transfer of power that had confused the other families, who couldn't understand why the lion would walk away from the kill. But as Victor watched Ethan trip, roll in the grass, and laugh, he knew he had traded a kingdom of dust for a kingdom of life. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, not in a cathedral or a grand ballroom, but in the small Brooklyn bakery where their second life had begun. Victor had bought the building, renovated the apartments above, and updated the kitchen, but he had insisted the storefront remain exactly the same, right down to the bell that chimed when the door opened. The air smelled of vanilla and warm sugar, finally exorcising the scent of gunpowder that had clung to them for so long. There were no politicians, no rival dons, and no press, just Marco, the hospital staff who had saved Ethan, and a few neighbors who had known Amelia when she was invisible. When Amelia walked down the aisle, a path between display cases filled with cannoli and sfogliatelle, she wore a simple white dress that showed the faint scars on her arms, badges of the war she had fought to keep their son alive. Victor didn't see a victim. He saw a warrior queen who had brought a tyrant to his knees without ever firing a shot. They exchanged vows in hushed tones, promises made not to a god they feared, but to the family they had forged in fire. When Victor slid the ring onto her finger, his hand, the hand that had pulled triggers and signed death warrants, was steady and gentle. He looked at Amelia, really looked at her, and saw the forgiveness in her eyes that he hadn't earned but would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. Ethan stood between them, holding both their hands, a living bridge between the man Victor was and the man he wanted to be. As they kissed, the small crowd cheered, a sound of genuine joy that drowned out the sirens wailing in the distance, a reminder that the dangerous world still turned, but it no longer turned for them. They had stepped off the carousel of violence, choosing the quiet dignity of a life built on love rather than fear. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the city in hues of purple and gold, Victor pushed Ethan on the swing set in the small park behind the bakery. "Higher, Daddy, higher!" Ethan shrieked, his head thrown back, trying to kick the clouds. Victor pushed him, feeling the solid weight of his son, checking his watch not to see if he was late for a sit-down, but to see how many more minutes of daylight he had to memorize this moment. He thought of his mother, sitting alone in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by silence, and he felt a pang of pity for the woman who had chosen power over this. She had wanted him to be a king, but looking at his wife smiling from the bench and his son flying through the air, Victor realized he was something far greater. He was a father, and for the first time in his life, the gun in his past was silent, and the future was nothing but a wide, open sky. Victor's journey teaches us that the chains of family trauma can be broken, but only if we are brave enough to wield the hammer ourselves. He had to lose everything, his pride, his mother, his status, to find the only thing that was real. It reminds us that family isn't defined by whose blood runs in your veins, but by who is willing to bleed for you when the world catches fire. Victor Carbone chose the legacy of a name and ended up with nothing, while Amelia chose love and ended up with everything. This has been another story from Sunni Romance. We hope it touched that part of you that believes in second chances and the power of redemption. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had to cut someone out of your life to save your own peace, even if it was someone you loved? It's the hardest choice we ever make, but sometimes it's the only way to survive. Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to Sunni Romance for more tales of love, danger, and the resilience of the human heart. Until next time, remember that the strongest walls aren't made of stone, but of the people who stand beside us.